Have you ever considered that what you fear most about the darkness might actually be your greatest protection? What if the very shadows that haunt your waking moments, those archons of dread that seem to rule your thoughts, were actually illusions of power sustained only by your belief in them? Mary Magdalene, perhaps the most misunderstood of all spiritual figures, carried a secret so profound that it threatened the very foundations of control that have governed human consciousness for millennia. The mystery lies not in fighting these archons of fear, but in a simple act of recognition so immediate that it dissolves their power instantly. This isn't about battle or spiritual warfare. It's about remembering something we've always known, but were conditioned to forget. The secret that Mary held close wasn't just knowledge. It was a way of being that rendered fear obsolete in a single breath. What I'm about to share with you isn't merely ancient wisdom rediscovered, but a living truth that has been waiting patiently beneath layers of distortion and deliberate obscurity. By the end of our journey together, you'll understand why this revelation was too dangerous to remain in the canonical texts, and why even now, as you hear these words, something deep within you is already beginning to awaken. Hidden within the fragments of texts that escaped destruction, buried in the sands of Egypt at Nag Hammadi, whispered through the Gospel of Mary, and encoded in the Pistis Sophia, lies a revelation about fear that changes everything. Mary Magdalene, far from being the repentant sinner portrayed by patriarchal tradition, was actually Jesus' most spiritually advanced disciple, entrusted with teachings too profound for the others to comprehend. The texts speak of how she alone understood the nature of the archons, those forces that create the illusion of separation and fear in human consciousness. While the male disciples argued about doctrine and position, Mary had already transcended the very framework of their debates. She understood something fundamental about the architecture of fear that the institutional keepers of faith have spent centuries trying to suppress. The forbidden wisdom she carried wasn't about techniques or rituals or even beliefs. It was a direct insight into the nature of reality itself, one that threatened the entire structure of spiritual control and intermediaries. For if people knew what Mary knew about dissolving fear instantly, they would no longer need systems of salvation or elaborate hierarchies of spiritual authority. This knowledge wasn't hidden because it was complex or difficult to understand. Quite the opposite. It was concealed precisely because it is so immediate, so accessible, and so transformative that it returns spiritual sovereignty to each individual in a single moment of recognition. If these words resonate with the quiet knowing that has always lived within you, I invite you to join us on this remembrance journey. This space we're creating together isn't about new information. It's about ancient recognition. It's about the wisdom that precedes all teaching and survives all forgetting. Those who are drawn to this message are not here by accident. You've been carrying fragments of this knowing throughout many lifetimes, waiting for the moment when enough of us remember together. The subscription bell you see isn't just a digital function. It's a modern echo of the ancient bells that once called the initiated to gather in sacred communion with truth. Join our circle of remembrance. When you subscribe, you're not following a channel. You're reconnecting with a lineage of wisdom that has been preserved against all odds. You're declaring your readiness to remember what fear made you forget. In the Gnostic cosmology that Mary Magdalene understood so intimately, our reality exists within a complex interplay of forces. The archons, those rulers or authorities, were understood not as demons in the conventional sense, but as energetic patterns that structure human experience into limitation and fear. They were seen as the servants of the demiurge, the false god who mistakenly believes himself to be the ultimate creator. unaware of the true divine fullness that lies beyond his comprehension. These archons create what the Gnostics called the Haimarmen, the fate mechanism, the cosmic prison of predictable causes and effects that keeps consciousness trapped in repetitive patterns. They are not external entities to be battled with sword or prayer, but internal structures of perception that create the very experience of separation that gives rise to fear. Mary Magdalene understood that these archons maintain their power through our ignorance of our true nature. Each archon represents a different quality of forgetting, a different way that divine consciousness becomes entangled in the illusion of limitation. They are the architects of what we might now call the ego identity, the false self that believes itself to be isolated, vulnerable, and, ultimately, mortal. The Gospel of Mary describes how she alone among the disciples comprehended the illusory nature of these forces. While others sought to fight against darkness, she had realized that darkness itself is merely the absence of recognition. The text describes how she turned within and discovered that the very fear that seemed to imprison her was itself a kind of veil, substantial only to those who believe in its reality. In the Pistis Sophia, we find the account of how Sophia, divine wisdom herself, became entangled in the lower realms through a movement of curiosity and compassion. This fall wasn't a sin, but a sacred descent, wisdom entering into matter itself to transform it from within. Mary Magdalene was understood to embody this same principle, the divine feminine wisdom that descends not to escape the world, but to illuminate it from its very core. The most radical aspect of Mary's teaching was that these cosmic dramas were not merely mythological explanations of distant divine events, but maps of processes occurring within human consciousness itself. The fall and redemption of Sophia wasn't something that happened out there in cosmic history. It's happening right now, within the field of your awareness, as wisdom remembers itself, even in the midst of forgetting. What if the story of Mary Magdalene's insight into dissolving Archon fear isn't about ancient history at all? What if it's actually the story of what's possible in this very moment as you listen to these words? The revolutionary insight at the heart of Mary Magdalene's understanding was that fear itself is a misperception, a case of mistaken identity. What appears as fearsome archons ruling our lives are actually aspects of our own consciousness that have forgotten their true nature. The instant dissolution of fear that Mary taught wasn't about defeating these forces, about recognizing them as distorted reflections of our own divine awareness. This is why her teaching was considered so dangerous by those invested in systems of spiritual control. If fear can be dissolved through direct recognition rather than through ritual, sacrifice, or moral purification, then the entire edifice of intermediary salvation collapses. If the archons are not powerful entities, but misperceptions to be seen through, then spiritual authority based on protection from these forces becomes unnecessary. The psychological truth hidden within the mythic language is profound. What we experience as fear is actually the sensation of our own life energy contracting around a thought of separation. The archons, psychologically understood, are those habitual patterns of perception that convince us we are isolated, vulnerable entities in a hostile universe, rather than expressions of the unified field of consciousness itself. Mary's insight transforms our understanding of spiritual practice itself. Rather than seeing spirituality as a battle between light and darkness, she recognized it as the gentle process of bringing awareness to the places where we've forgotten our true nature. The archons aren't defeated through force, they're embraced through recognition, and in that recognition, their seeming solidity dissolves. This understanding changes everything about how we relate to fear. Instead of trying to banish it, control it, or overcome it, all strategies that paradoxically reinforce its apparent reality, Mary Magdalene's approach invites us to turn toward fear with clear seeing. What happens when you look directly at fear without believing the story it tells about who you are? What happens when you recognize that the very awareness in which fear appears is itself untouched by fear? The philosophical revelation here is that consciousness itself, your fundamental nature, is inherently free from fear. Fear can arise within consciousness as a temporary experience, but it cannot define or contain consciousness itself. Just as a mirror reflects images without becoming what it reflects, your fundamental awareness witnesses fear without becoming fear. This is the instant dissolution that Mary understood, not the disappearance of the sensation, but the recognition that you are the open space in which sensation appears. This insight doesn't deny the practical reality of danger in the physical world. Mary Magdalene wasn't teaching a naive disregard for legitimate threats. Rather, she was pointing to the difference between practical caution and existential dread, between responding appropriately to circumstances and being ruled by the Archon-like thought patterns that generate a continuous state of anxiety and separation. The most profound aspect of this teaching is that it's not something you need to achieve or develop. The freedom from fear that Mary Magdalene discovered isn't the result of years of practice or special attainment.
It's the natural state of consciousness when it's not contracting around stories of isolation and vulnerability. It's who you already are beneath the layers of forgetting. This is why the recognition can be instant. You don't need to become something other than what you are. You need only to recognize what you've always been, beneath the Archon veils of misidentification. If this revelation stirs something deep within you, a resonance that feels more like remembering than learning, I invite you to acknowledge this recognition. The simple act of pressing the like button becomes a modern gesture of what the ancient traditions called ascent to truth, a moment when the soul recognizes itself in the mirror of wisdom. This recognition isn't about endorsing content in the conventional sense. It's about honoring that place within you that already knows what these words are pointing toward. When you like this message, you're not approving an external teaching. You're acknowledging the internal resonance of truth with truth. In the mystery traditions that preserved Mary Magdalene's wisdom, such moments of recognition were considered sacred. They marked the points where the veil between forgetting and remembering grew thin, where the soul caught a glimpse of its own reflection in the waters of wisdom. Your engagement becomes part of this ancient lineage of recognition, a quiet affirmation that something essential has been remembered. The ripples of this recognition extend beyond your individual experience. Each acknowledgement helps others find their way to this remembering. In a world so dominated by Archon-like patterns of fear and separation, every moment of clear seeing creates space for others to see clearly as well. Your recognition becomes a lantern in the darkness, silent but luminous. Let your engagement be a wordless testament to the truth you've recognized, not as a social media function, but as a contemporary expression of what the Gnostics called the movement of the soul toward its source, the natural turning of consciousness toward its own freedom.
Think about the last time fear gripped you. Not just concern or momentary alarm, but that deep, pervasive dread that seems to define your very being. Perhaps it was fear of failure, of rejection, of loss, or even of death itself. Remember how in those moments the fear seemed to become your entire reality? This is exactly how the Archon patterns function in human experience. They create a perceptual tunnel where all you can see is the threat, and all you can feel is your vulnerability to it.
Mary Magdalene's insight speaks directly to these very human moments. She understood that in the grip of fear, we forget something essential about our nature. We identify completely with the vulnerable self that appears within consciousness, forgetting that we are also the consciousness in which that self appears. This forgetting isn't your fault. It's the natural result of being human in a world that constantly reinforces the message of separation. You've been taught since childhood to identify exclusively with your thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations, to believe I am afraid rather than fear is appearing in my awareness. This subtle distinction makes all the difference. When you believe I am afraid, the fear becomes your identity. When you recognize fear is appearing in my awareness, you rediscover yourself as the spaciousness in which fear arises and passes. Have you noticed how fear thrives in the imagination but dissolves in presence? When you're fully present with the actual sensations of fear, the tightness in your chest, the shallow breathing, the racing thoughts, without adding the story about what it means about you or your future, something remarkable happens. The fear may not immediately disappear, but your relationship to it transforms completely. It no longer defines you. It no longer rules you. This is what Mary understood about the instant dissolution of Archon fear. The dissolution isn't about making the experience go away. It's about recognizing that the experience doesn't define the awareness in which it appears. Just as clouds pass through the sky without becoming the sky, fear passes through your awareness without becoming your essence. Think of how often your fears have created elaborate futures that never came to pass. The Archon patterns specialize in projecting threatening scenarios that feel utterly real and inevitable until they don't materialize. How much of your life energy has been consumed by preparing for catastrophes that existed only in thought? This isn't to minimize genuine challenges, but to recognize how fear distorts our perception of what's actually happening. Mary Magdalene's approach offers a radical alternative to both fighting fear and being controlled by it. Instead, she invites us into a third possibility: being present with fear from the spaciousness of awareness itself. From this perspective, fear isn't something to overcome. It's something to be witnessed with compassion and clarity. In that witnessing, its grip naturally loosens. The most liberating aspect of this understanding is that it's available to you right now, in this very moment. You don't need special circumstances or years of preparation. Wherever you are, whatever you're experiencing, you can pause and recognize, I am the awareness in which this experience is appearing. This simple recognition is the key that Mary Magdalene discovered, the key that dissolves Archon fear instantly. What Mary Magdalene discovered through her own direct experience was that consciousness itself, your fundamental nature, is inherently free from fear. The mythic language of archons and divine sparks points toward this psychological and spiritual reality. The divine spark isn't a poetic metaphor for some distant potential. It's the direct recognition of what you already are beneath the layers of conditioned identity. When we bring together the mythic understanding of archons with the psychological reality of fear patterns, and then view both through the lens of direct experience, a profound integration occurs. We begin to see that what the ancient texts described in cosmic terms is actually an intimate process occurring within our own awareness in each moment. The archons, those seemingly powerful forces that create the experience of limitation, exist only through our agreement with them. Their authority depends entirely on our forgetting our true nature. This is why Mary's approach was so revolutionary and remains so relevant today. She understood that freedom from fear doesn't come through battle, but through recognition. the clear seeing that dissolves the very foundation of fear's apparent reality. This recognition isn't intellectual understanding, it's direct realization. It's the difference between knowing about water and actually drinking it. When you directly recognize that you are the awareness in which all experiences arise, something shifts at the very root of your being. The Archon patterns may still appear as thoughts and sensations, but they no longer convince you that they define who you are. The integration of this understanding happens naturally as you bring this recognition into your daily life. Each time you pause in the midst of fear to recognize your true nature as awareness itself, you're weakening the habitual patterns that have seemed so solid for so long. Each moment of clear seeing is both an ending and a beginning. The ending of an old pattern of identification and the beginning of a new way of being with experience. This is the freedom that Mary Magdalene discovered and that has been preserved despite centuries of misunderstanding and distortion. It's not freedom from experiencing fear, but freedom from being defined by it. It's the profound recognition that you are not what appears within you. You are the space in which it all appears. Perhaps what we've been calling fear all along wasn't really the enemy we imagined. Perhaps fear itself was only ever a contracted form of love, a love that had forgotten its own nature and become fixated on protection rather than expansion. What if the archons that seemed so threatening were actually distorted reflections of our own divine qualities, waiting to be recognized and reintegrated? Mary Magdalene's secret wasn't about conquering darkness, but about recognizing its true nature as light in disguise. The instant dissolution of fear she discovered wasn't about making something disappear, but about seeing through the illusion of separation that made fear seem solid in the first place. When you recognize that the awareness in which fear appears is inherently fearless, the Archon spell is broken, not through force, but through clear seeing. This recognition doesn't make you special or spiritual. It simply returns you to your natural state, the condition that has always been yours beneath the layers of forgetting. It's like the sun remembering it's the sun after believing it was merely one of its own rays. Nothing new is created in this recognition. What's already true is simply acknowledged. The paradox we began with now reveals its deeper meaning. What you feared most about the darkness was indeed your greatest protection, but not in the way you might have thought. The darkness itself, those places of fear and contraction, was protecting something precious: the opportunity to remember your true nature through contrast. Without the experience of forgetting, the joy of remembering would not be possible. And so, the archons themselves, those apparent rulers of fear, are transformed in our understanding. They were never the enemy. They were the disguised catalysts for the deepest recognition. In their very opposition, they created the conditions for remembrance. This doesn't mean we seek out fear or difficulty, but it does transform how we relate to the fears that naturally arise in human experience. The silence that follows this recognition isn't empty, it's pregnant with possibility. It's the open space of consciousness itself, recognized as your true nature. In this silence, the archons have no power, not because they've been defeated, but because they've been seen for what they truly are: temporary patterns in the endless ocean of awareness that you are. What word comes to mind as you contemplate this remembrance of your true nature? What single word captures the essence of what you've recognized about yourself beyond the archon veils of fear? Write that word in the comments below, not as a social media interaction, but as a declaration of remembrance. Your word becomes a beacon for others still caught in the grip of archon fear. It becomes a testament to the possibility of recognition that Mary Magdalene discovered and that lives on through each of us who remembers. In sharing your word of recognition, you join an ancient lineage of those who have seen through the illusion of fear to the freedom that has always been our birthright.